All right, everybody, welcome back to day two, part three of topic seven, lesson three, or chapter seven, section three. Today we're going to talk about the different characteristics of Southern society. We're going to start talking about what white Southern society, but everybody should know ahead of time that at this point in time, the South had kind of a hierarchy or different levels of people in their society. And there will be basically the five levels, is what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to start with white Southern society and move on to African American society at the time. So the Old South is often pictured as a land of vast plantations worked by hundreds of enslaved African Americans. This is kind of the stereotypical view of the South that most people have, that there's these big, huge, extravagant houses, everybody owns a bunch of land, and they have hundreds of enslaved African Americans working for them. That's kind of the stereotypical view of the South for this time period. However, most white Southerners were not actually all that rich, and most white people in the South at this time owned no enslaved African Americans at all. So it's going to be a select group of people that actually own slaves. And so this cottonocracy, they're going to be the highest level of people, but we'll talk about what group actually makes that up. So a planter is considered a person who owns at least 20 enslaved African Americans. So to be considered a planter, you have to own at least 20 enslaved workers. In 1860, only one white Southerner and 30 belonged to a planter family. So 1 in 30 actually qualified to be considered a planter by owning at least 20 slaves. An even smaller number of less than 1% would own 50% or more enslaved workers. So a very, very minuscule amount of people actually owned more than 50 enslaved people at the time. And remember that 1 out of 30 own 20 or more. So these very wealthy families were called the cottonocracy because they made huge amounts of money from the cotton. Rich planters also lived mainly in the cotton belt of the lowland South and in the coastal areas of South Carolina, Georgia, and Louisiana. So they lived where basically the richest soil and best climate for growing cotton is. These people got very, very wealthy off of cotton. And though few in number, their views and way of life are going to dominate the South and the way the South will operate. And the richest planters will build elegant homes and fill them with very expensive furniture from Europe. They're going to entertain lavishly and also try to dress and behave like European royalty. Basically, these people are going to view themselves as Southern royalty, as in they're better than everybody else, and they're expected to live up to this extravagant lifestyle, have really nice homes with really nice furniture, as well as always have huge, very fancy parties, and they're going to dress and behave like European royalty. Also, many would become political leaders in the South. And also, something else you should note for the cottonocracy is that they didn't work in their own fields ever. And usually they would hire other people to work in the fields and monitor their enslaved workers as well. The next level of society, so cottonocracy is at the top. Next would be the small farmers. About 75% of Southern whites would live on small family farms during this time period. These plain folk, as they were called, owned the land they farmed. So they're not the planter society or the cottonocracy society. They're the smaller farmers. They still own their land. Sorry, they might also own 1 or 2 enslaved African Americans. And unlike planters, plain folk will work with their enslaved workers in the field. So these small farmers, they're going to be referred to as plain folk. They own their own land that they're going to farm. They also might own 1 or 2 enslaved African Americans, and they're also working in their fields alongside of their enslaved workers. Small farmers could be found in most parts of the South, but their numbers were fewer in the Cotton Belt and in the coastal regions of the South, where plantation agriculture dominated. So, because these rich people basically bought up all the land and all the best land in the Cotton Belt, very few small farms are going to be found there. Among these farm families, helping one another would be a very important duty. So these small farmers would always work together to make sure everybody had everything they need and everybody was taken care of. It was a very important thing to them. Now, the middle group would be the poor whites. So they're going to be in the middle level of the social ladder. And so these whites did not own any enslaved African Americans, and many also didn't even own their own land that they farmed. So they're going to be the middle level. They're going to be the bottom of white society, but they're still going to be better than a couple groups. So these people in the poor whites, they would oftentimes rent their land, and to pay for the land, they would give part of the crop they grew to the landowner as payment. And these poor whites would barely make ends meet at this point. Now they're basically not going to have hardly anything to sell, and so most of their stuff will go to food that they're going to be eating. Poor whites often lived in the hilly wooded areas of the upland south and north and west of the Cotton Belt. So they're going to live in what we call the upland south. So this is going to be closer to like Tennessee, Kentucky, the mountainous region of Virginia and South Carolina. They planted crops such as corn, potatoes, and other vegetables. So they're not really growing cash crops that we stereotypically think of and talked about yesterday with the tobacco, cotton, and things like that. They're more focused on food that people will be consuming. They also will herd cattle and pigs, and so they will be livestock farmers as well. Poor whites also had very hard lives, and they enjoyed the rights that were denied to all black people and also enslaved, whether they are both enslaved or free. So, yeah, their life isn't great, but they still had more rights than African Americans did at the time, whether that African American was an enslaved person or free. So, now we're going to compare Northern and Southern white society. Like Northern whites, most Southern farmers were, or sorry, most Southern whites were farmers. So farming is still predominantly the main income for a majority of people in both the North and the South. Also, most white farmers in both regions were small farmers. They didn't own large tracts of land. Remember, that's just going to be a limited few people in the South that actually own huge amounts of land. A majority of people, both North and South, work very small family farms where they own all the land. However, there will be several important differences in white populations of the two regions. So, in the South, the wealthiest whites were planters who made their money from the work of enslaved African Americans, which is going to be vastly different from how it happened in the North, where the wealthiest whites were capitalists who made their money from investing in industry. So, in the South, the wealthiest people made their money being planters and on the hard work of enslaved African Americans. In the North, these people invested their money in industry and got rich on industry. Also, there were many white industrial workers and middle class people living in the cities in the North, and very relatively few Southerners of any class even lived in the cities. Remember, there's only going to be three major cities, and that's New Orleans, and as well as Charleston, South Carolina, and Richmond, Virginia. So, what was life like for African Americans in the South? So African Americans in the South will make up the two lower classes of Southern society. So at the top you have the cottonocracy and the planters, then you have the small farmers who own their land. Finally, you have the poor whites who really don't own any slaves or even own their own land. Now we're going to talk about the bottom two tiers, which will be the African Americans in the South during the 1840s and 50s. So both free and enslaved African Americans lived in the South. Yes, there were free African Americans in the South during this time period. Their legal and political conditions were very different, though, between each other. And although free under the law and with certain legal rights, free African Americans would face harsh discrimination, whereas enslaved African Americans had no rights at all. So free African Americans, yeah, they had some rights, but they were oftentimes discriminated against, and laws will be passed to kind of try to get rights taken away from the free African Americans, whereas enslaved African Americans had no rights at all. So free African Americans will be kind of our fourth level. And so most free African Americans were descendants of enslaved people who were freed during and after the American Revolution. Others had bought their freedom. If they could, they bought their freedom. Others were freed during the American Revolution for fighting on the side of the United States for X amount of time. They were freed. In 1860, though, more than 200,000 free blacks lived in the South. and most lived within Maryland and Delaware, where slavery was already on the decline in those two regions. Others in cities such as New Orleans, Richmond, and Charleston would be where they lived. So if they didn't live in Maryland and Delaware, um, a lot of the free African Americans would live in the city like New Orleans, Richmond, or Charleston, which are the only three major cities at the time in the South. Many free African Americans will also reach an impressive level of success. They will work as farmers, laborers, and artisans such as blacksmiths, carpenters, and cobblers. And cobblers are the people who make and fix shoes. And they will contribute to and influence Southern life. So, because they're going to be artisans and laborers, such as blacksmiths, carpenters, and cobblers, those are very important trades at this time, especially in Southern life, where they rely on people to produce these goods for their farms. Some also ran their own businesses, such as inns, barber shops, and a few would become large plantation owners, where they grow cotton and actually owned enslaved workers. So, yes, some African Americans did own enslaved workers. White slave owners did not like the free African Americans living in the South, though. They feared that free African Americans set a dangerous example, encouraging enslaved African Americans to rebel against their owners. And slave owners justified slavery by claiming that African Americans could not take care of themselves. However, free African Americans basically proved this idea wrong, and that's why the slave owners did not like them. So, to discourage free African Americans, Southern states will pass laws that limit their freedom and economic opportunities, much like they will do again after the American Civil War in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Free African Americans were also not allowed to vote or travel that much. In southern states, they had to move out of the state or risk the chance of being kidnapped and enslaved. And despite these limits, free African Americans were able to make a life for themselves and also make a valuable contribution to Southern life. One invention that African American had was a way to refine sugar, and another would be the invention of a seed planter, so it no longer had to be done by hand. So, enslaved African Americans, by far, they were the lowest and had the toughest life. By 1860, enslaved African Americans made up 1/3 of the South's population, and most worked as field hands on cotton plantations. Both men and women cleared new land and planted and harvested crops, while the children would help by pulling weeds, collecting wood, and carrying water to the field hands. And by the time they were teenagers, though, these children would work between 12 and 14 hours a day. And daily labor in the fields bound enslaved workers into a community of people who tried to help and protect one another. And we'll talk a little bit more about this community tomorrow. Now, on large plantations, some enslaved African Americans had better positions than just being a field hand. They might work as household servants or as skilled artisans such as carpenters and blacksmiths on the plantation. Such jobs might entitle workers to better food or clothing than the field hands as well. And few enslaved people will work in cities, mostly just free African Americans did. And their earnings for those that did work in cities would belong to the owners. And unlike free African Americans, enslaved African Americans could not easily start their own businesses. And another major difference you should be aware of between social circumstances of free and enslaved African Americans was that enslaved African American families could be broken up by their owners, with family members sold separately and to different owners, which would put them on different plantations. And finally, while they faced discrimination, free African American families were not forced to separate like those of enslaved African Americans. So we will continue tomorrow discussing slavery in the South as well as how African Americans will resist their enslavement. So this is all you have for today. Make sure you wrote down anything that you did not already have in your notes that you took yesterday. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. We will be finishing section 3 tomorrow.